You are not weak. You are not broken. What you feel, this compulsion that seems bigger than you, this need that dominates you, this emptiness that insists on returning, this is not madness. It is not failure. It is not a moral defect. This is pain. And all pain has an origin. Carl Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the human soul, said that many vices are not just destructive habits, but desperate attempts to find something sacred. In one of his most famous letters, written to the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, he was direct. Addiction is a frustrated, spiritual quest. It is the soul crying out for meaning, trying to touch the infinite, and finding only alcohol, drugs, excess, chaos. Jung called this spiritus contra spiritum, the true spirit at war with the false spirit. On the other side, Gabor Maté, a doctor and psychiatrist who dedicated his life to understanding the root of human suffering, states, "The question is not why addiction. The question is, why the pain?" For him, addiction is not the problem. It is the solution someone found to cope with a trauma that still lives within. And if you take a moment to observe your own story honestly, you might realize this too, that what drives you to repeat the same behaviors, to sabotage yourself, to run away from yourself, is not pleasure. It is anesthesia. This video is not a lesson. It is not a judgment. It is a mirror. Here, we will look together at what you may have been avoiding for a long time. We will talk about what happens behind addiction, whether it is to drugs, alcohol, food, sex, work, shopping, or even constant distraction. Because deep down, all of this is just an attempt to fill the same void. Buddhism speaks of the realm of hungry ghosts, beings with small mouths and enormous stomachs, starving for something that never arrives. Gabor Maté uses this metaphor to describe the addict, someone who feels an insatiable hunger for connection, for presence, for belonging, but who, not knowing where to find it, seeks relief in whatever is possible. Even if that relief costs everything. Perhaps you're tired. Perhaps you're wondering if there is a way out. I'm not here to promise you an easy cure, but I guarantee you one thing. There is a path, and it begins when you understand that addiction is a symptom, not the disease. Pain is not the end. It is a calling. And if you have the courage to listen, you may discover that there is another life waiting on the other side. Now, let's go together. Because understanding addiction is understanding yourself. And this can change everything. Addiction does not begin with the substance. It begins with pain. Before the first dose, the first escape, the first compulsive behavior, there was a body in suffering. There was a neglected heart. There was a scared, confused, lonely child who learned too early that the world was not a safe place. Hungarian-Canadian physician Gabor Maté spent decades living with people whom the world preferred to forget. Homeless individuals, chronic drug users, patients abandoned by the healthcare system and their own families. And what he discovered was this: all of them, without exception, carried a deep emotional wound. Many were abused, neglected, ignored, beaten, or simply deprived of love. And even those who did not experience severe traumas in the classical sense still lived experiences of emotional disconnection sufficient to shape their brains towards suffering. Addiction, according to Maté, is the attempt to alleviate that pain. He says, the real question is never why addiction, but rather why the pain. And that question changes everything. Because when you understand this, you stop seeing addictive behavior as a whim, as weakness, as a stupid choice. And you start to see it as a legitimate, albeit destructive, response to legitimate pain. The addicted brain is not a weak brain. It is a brain that has learned to protect itself. When you use a substance or dive into compulsive behavior, your body releases dopamine, the neurotransmitter of reward, pleasure, survival. It is the same system activated when we feel love, acceptance, connection. But for many, those experiences were absent or painful. So the brain learns to seek the same relief elsewhere: alcohol, cocaine, pornography, ultra-processed food, shopping, social media, gaming, status. Maté describes addicts as inhabitants of the kingdom of hungry ghosts, an image drawn from Buddhism. In this symbolic view, these creatures have small mouths, narrow throats, and enormous stomachs, hungry for something they can never digest. It is the perfect image of the addicted soul, always seeking, always consuming, but never filled. Because what is sought, in fact, is not the substance. It is the feeling of being whole. It is the attempt to anesthetize the silent scream of the inner child that was never heard. And perhaps you recognize yourself in this. Perhaps your compulsion is not for something that visibly destroys your life. Perhaps it is something more subtle, more disguised, more socially accepted. But the question still stands: what are you trying to avoid feeling? While the world continues to punish the behavior, the pain that fuels it continues to grow, silent, invisible. That is why treatments based solely on abstinence fail so often. Because they combat the symptom but ignore the cause. And as long as the wound is open, the mind will continue to seek relief, no matter the cost. But what if what you are seeking out there, in the substance, in the escape, in excess, is actually within you? What if real relief does not come from anesthesia, but from reconnecting with your own soul? This is where Carl Jung comes in. For him, addiction is not just an attempt to escape pain. It is a misguided attempt to seek the sacred. In the next part, we will dive into Jung's profound view of addiction as a spiritual crisis, and understand why he believed that the true antidote to compulsion lies in reconnecting with the self. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. For Carl Jung, addiction was never just a behavioral disorder, much less a matter of lack of willpower. He saw it as a deep symptom of spiritual disorientation, a cry of the soul in search of meaning, a desperate attempt to reconnect with the self, the psychic totality, using tools that in the end only deepen the internal schism. Jung understood that human beings cannot bear to live disconnected from their own center. And when that connection is broken, whether by trauma, repression, social conditioning, or loss of identity, the psyche seeks a way to compensate. This compensation, when it does not find healthy or symbolic paths, manifests through destructive means: obsessions, compulsions, addictions. It is as if the individual, upon losing contact with their inner axis, begins to seek substitutes for the sacred. And many find this in alcohol, drugs, or any behavior that provokes an alteration of consciousness. This is what Jung realized when writing to Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. In this historic letter, Jung explains that for many, the desire for alcohol is, in fact, the unconscious desire for a mystical experience, for an expanded state of consciousness, for transcendence. Spiritus contra spiritum, the true spirit in opposition to the false spirit. Substance as a simulacrum of the divine. It is a bold statement. But think carefully. What does addiction offer, if not a feeling, albeit brief, of relief, peace, ecstasy, or escape? The problem is not what the addict seeks. The problem is where they are looking. Jung believed that behind every compulsion lies a legitimate impulse of the soul, an impulse to return to the center, to reconnect with the self. But when this impulse does not find conscious expression, whether due to repression, fear, trauma, or conditioning, it escapes through the cracks and manifests as destructive behavior. It is denied spirituality that returns through the shadow. That is why, for Jung, true recovery cannot come solely from abstinence or rationalization. It must involve the journey back to the self, the construction of a symbolic life, the integration of opposites, because deep down, the addict is someone who has lost the thread of connection with their own soul and tries to restore that connection in the only way they know, seeking outside what is, and has always been, inside. But there is a deep obstacle on this journey, a hidden enemy that lives within all of us, and which is often the greatest responsible for pushing us into addiction, the shadow, that which we repress, deny, and try to forget. In the next part, we will explore how the shadow feeds addictions and why it needs to be faced head-on if we truly want to free ourselves. Within you lies an unknown territory, a place made up of everything you have been forced to hide, repress, deny, or forget. This place, in Jungian psychology, is called the shadow. It is precisely this repressed content, this unlived part of the psyche, that largely fuels addictive behaviors. The shadow is composed of everything that, at some point in life, you learned should not be. Anger, shame, fear, desire, sadness, vulnerability, power, sexuality, ambition. Everything that was not accepted or embraced, whether by family, culture, or religion, was pushed deep into the mind. But the fact that something is repressed does not mean it ceases to exist. Quite the opposite. What is banished from consciousness begins to act in the shadows, influencing thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in an indirect, compulsive, and often self-destructive manner. Jung said that what you do not make conscious manifests in your life as fate. Addiction, in this context, is not an act of free choice. It is the symptom of a divided psyche. It is the shadow asking for passage. It is the swallowed anger that turns into internal explosion. It is the unprocessed pain that turns into compulsion. It is the suffocated vulnerability that disguises itself as anesthesia. Think for a moment. How many times have you repeated behaviors you swore to abandon? How many times have you sabotaged yourself, even knowing rationally that it would harm you? How many times have you felt possessed by a force that seemed greater than you? This is not lack of discipline. This is unconscious content trying to emerge. And the more you struggle to repress it, the stronger it becomes. Addiction settles in as a way to contain the explosion, a pressure valve for everything that consciousness does not want or cannot face. And here lies the trap. As long as you treat addiction as the enemy, you will only be fighting the symptom. The root lies deeper. It is in what you do not want to look at. It is in the shadow you fear to touch. But it is precisely there that healing resides. The journey of deep recovery requires courage to descend, to traverse the depths of the psyche, to name what was hidden. It is painful, it is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Because when you integrate the shadow, it ceases to control you. It becomes part of your power, and no longer your tormentor. The shadow is the territory of trauma, of unresolved childhood, of the memories that shaped your emotional and neurological circuits. In the next part, we will go even deeper. We will understand how traumas and early experiences of disconnection create the fertile ground where addiction takes root, and why what a person has lived, even if they have forgotten, still inhabits every choice the individual makes. Before addiction existed, there was abandonment. Before compulsive behavior, there was absence. Before substance abuse, there was pain. A pain that did not know how to name itself, but screamed in the silence of the body. And that is where we need to start. At the beginning of the wound. Because no one is born addicted. Addiction is an adaptation, a creative response of the psyche to an unbearable reality. Gabor Maté is incisive in stating, "The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it is connection. And this statement carries a disconcerting truth. Most addicted individuals are not seeking pleasure, but relief. Relief from chronic loneliness, from feelings of inadequacy, from the anguish of not feeling loved, seen, or belonging. And this pain rarely begins in adulthood. It is born in childhood, in the early years of life, often even before we can talk about it. Science shows that the early years of development profoundly shape the human brain. A child's nervous system organizes itself based on the emotional experiences it receives. If it grows surrounded by love, acceptance, and emotional presence, its brain develops circuits of safety, trust, and regulation. But if it grows in an environment of neglect, instability, abuse, or emotional coldness, those same circuits become dysfunctional. The child learns that the world is not safe, and worse, it learns that its pain will not be cared for. But trauma is not limited to major events. One does not need to have suffered physical violence or explicit abuse to be traumatized. What constitutes trauma is the subjective experience of helplessness. It is when the emotional system is overwhelmed by something it cannot process, and that remains frozen in the body. And that is where addiction comes in, as an attempt to regulate what has never been regulated. Imagine addiction as an emotional prosthesis. It arises where containment was lacking, where there was no nurturing, where there was no listening. It offers what the inner child pleaded for and did not receive: relief, control, comfort. The use of the substance, or the compulsive behavior, temporarily calms the nervous system. It brings a false sense of belonging, power, peace. But it is a fragile relief. That comes at an increasingly high price. The body of the addict carries memories that the mind often forgets. Memories of constant tension, emotional abandonment, of not feeling worthy of love. And that is why deep recovery cannot ignore the body. Because it is in the body that trauma lives. It is in the body that the wound pulses. And it is through the body that healing must occur. Addiction, then, is less a disease and more a desperate attempt at self-regulation, at survival, at coping with a pain that no one saw. And when you truly understand this, something changes. Guilt gives way to compassion, and shame begins, little by little, to dissolve. But there is still an essential element missing: confrontation. Because understanding the origin of addiction is not enough. It is necessary to traverse this territory, to descend to the root of the pain. Jung said that no tree grows to the sky without its roots touching hell. And that is exactly what we will talk about in the next part, about the courage to descend, to touch one's own darkness, and to make pain a portal to transformation. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebook, Beyond the Shadow. It breaks down Jung's core ideas and gives you tools to understand yourself more deeply. Link is in the pinned comment. There is a dangerous illusion surrounding the idea of recovery, a fantasy sold by self-help slogans and hasty speeches that it is possible to overcome addiction solely through willpower, positive thinking, or habit change. But the truth is different, and it is harsh. The true healing process is not an upward climb. It is a descent. Carl Jung made this clear with one of his most powerful phrases: "No tree grows to the sky without its roots touching hell." And this hell, in the addict's journey, is not metaphorical. It is real, concrete, felt in the flesh. It is the plunge into one's own unconscious. It is the reunion with everything that has been denied, forgotten, locked away, but that has never ceased to exist. Healing begins when the individual stops fleeing, when, for the first time, they accept to look at the pain instead of anesthetizing it, when they understand that the hunger that never goes away, that hole that nothing fills, will not disappear with another dose, another click, another purchase, another distraction. It will only stop hurting when it is heard. Descending is, above all, an act of courage. It means facing the shadow head-on. Recognizing one's own ghosts without masks, sitting with anguish, guilt, and shame, and enduring the discomfort of being naked before oneself. It is not pretty, it is not quick, it is lonely, sometimes brutal, but it is real, and it is necessary. This process requires a complete change of posture. It is stepping out of the logic of war against oneself. I need to conquer addiction. I need to conquer my impulses, and entering a logic of reconciliation. Addiction is not an enemy to be destroyed. It is a messenger, a distorted and painful guide that points exactly where the wound is. The substance or behavior that destroys is the same that reveals. It shows the path that needs to be taken. It shows where it hurts, where it lacks, where it bleeds. And this journey is not just psychological. It is spiritual, because addiction is, at its core, a crisis of meaning, a failed attempt to reconnect with something greater. The addict is someone exiled from themselves, disconnected from the self, fragmented inside. Recovery, then, is not just about stopping use or stopping the addictive behavior. It is about reconstituting that wholeness. It is about integrating. It is about returning to inhabit one's own center. But this return is only possible when the pain is traversed, not avoided. And this only happens in silence, in confronting the void, in abandoning illusions. One must die to the old identity and be reborn, not as someone healed, but as someone whole, who no longer needs to flee, who can finally be present in their own life. This rebirth, however, does not happen all at once. It is built, little by little, with awareness, with support, with presence. And it is only possible when the person understands that they are not broken, they are disconnected, that they are not bad, they are wounded, and that they are not alone. They are, like all of us, seeking a way back home. In the last part of this video, we will close this cycle. We will talk about what it really means to be free, about the awakening that happens when pain is embraced, when the shadow. There is a dangerous illusion surrounding the idea of recovery, a fantasy sold by self-help slogans and hasty speeches that it is possible to overcome addiction solely through willpower, positive thinking, or habit change. But the truth is different. Overcoming an addiction is not just about abandoning a substance or destructive habit. It is about being reborn. It is about reconstructing an identity. It is about returning to inhabit a body that once served only as a repository of pain. It is about learning to be present where there was once only escape. When someone frees themselves from a compulsive behavior, what is broken is not just the bond with the substance. It is the pact with the lie that you need to numb yourself to live. For a long time, you may have believed that it was just the way it is, that there was no way out, that what controlled you was stronger than you. And in a way, it was. Because the pain you carried was also older than you. It was the pain of the child who was not welcomed, of the teenager who was silenced, of the adult who learned to smile while crumbling inside. But now, perhaps for the first time, you have begun to see this pain with different eyes, not as weakness, but as a sign, as a call. You are not your addiction. You are not the repetition of your failures. You are the awareness that observes all of this and, little by little, learns to choose differently. And this awareness only awakens when the anesthesia loses its function, when the hole can no longer be filled with distractions, when the emptiness begins to be inhabited with truth, with presence, with silence. Jung teaches us that the soul does not seek perfection, but wholeness. This means that healing does not depend on eliminating your shadows, but on integrating them. What makes you strong is not the absence of pain, but the willingness to feel it without fleeing, And that, in itself, is already a miracle. If you have made it this far, it is because something in you wants to change. Something in you is already changing. And that deserves to be recognized. The journey is long. It requires patience, humility, courage. But it is possible. And above all, it is worth it. So, if this video spoke to you, if at any moment you felt seen or understood, leave a comment down below. Tell me, what resonated most with your story? What part pierced through you? I read all the comments, and you can be sure your story matters. And if you want to continue this process, this dive, this crossing towards yourself, also watch the next video. It is an important continuation of this path, a piece that completes what we started here. Don't forget to like, share with someone who needs to hear this, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Because this is not just a channel about psychology, it is a space for awakening, and you deserve to be awake. Let's go together.